Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to go over the basics of working at the command line in our Linux virtual machine. So the first thing you'll want to do is go ahead and open up your virtual machine by launching VirtualBox and then double clicking on your virtual machine. You know you've launched your virtual machine successfully when you can see the desktop that looks like this. So while you're getting that launched, let's take a look at some of the learning objectives for this lesson. So we're going to talk about what it means to use the command line, and we'll learn a little bit of jargon with that, like terminal or command prompt or console. We're also going to talk about paths, which are something that you've been working with, even though you may not have known they were called paths. Now, there are two different types of paths, relative and absolute, and we'll go through the differences between the two. And then, once we know a little bit about paths and the terminal, we'll be able to execute some commands at the command line in Linux. So in all of my videos, there'll usually be something called a warm-up task, which is just something to kind of warm up your fingers for typing, or just kind of warm up your brain for getting ready to work with some new topics or some new concepts. So typically you'll want to just get started right away with the warm-up task, which I've already told you what it is for this lesson, opening up VirtualBox and launching your VM. And VM is short for virtual machine. Now, as we start to learn more Linux commands and we start to work with C++ and programming, these warm-up tasks will usually have you start by opening up a new C++ program and starting to type away some code. Now, what we're going to do in this lesson is keep track of all of the new terminology that we're going to learn, because there will be a lot. So I'm going to separate the board into two regions. On this side over here, we'll have some vocab words, and then on this side over here, we'll have the Linux commands we're going to learn today. So we've already learned some vocab that I'm not going to write up here, but we've learned VM is short for virtual machine, and we've heard some terms like Linux, command line, and terminal. So let's go ahead and start discussing the command line. So many of you are probably working on a Windows machine. If you hit your Windows key and type CMD, that's short for command prompt. That will open up the command prompt, which is a little program where you can type commands. Now, back before we had these nice graphical desktops like this one you see here, where we can open up files and see them in a nice file explorer, or I can do this on my Mac and I can see this in a nice Finder window. Back before we had all that, most of the interaction done with the computer was through text, and that was at something called the command line, where on a line you could write a command and press enter to execute it. Now, what you've just opened up in Windows is something called the command prompt, which is Windows version of the command line. And the command prompt has evolved out of something called MS-DOS, which you might have heard of, you might not have. It's okay if you haven't. But that was like a really, really early version of Windows. Now, I'm on a Mac, so I can go ahead and open up the terminal on a Mac and show you what that looks like. So this is what the terminal looks like on a Mac. Note that I'm calling it a terminal instead of calling it a command prompt. Terminal is more of a Unix-y background base name. So Mac operating system is derived from Unix, just like Linux. And if you're interested in learning more about Linux versus Unix or Mac versus Unix, definitely do a Google search and read up a little bit about it. So now that you have a little bit of a background about what the command line is, let's take a look at the command line in Linux. So in your VM, there are three ways to launch the terminal. And remember, terminal is just a name for the command line in a Unix-like operating system. So I'm going to go through the three ways that you can use to open up a terminal. On the desktop, you can double-click on this LX terminal shortcut, and it will bring up the terminal. So this is what the terminal looks like in our VM. Down at the bottom in your taskbar, there's also a shortcut in order to open up the terminal. You can also head over to the Start menu, go to System Tools, and click on Terminal. So there's two ways, one using the shortcuts on the desktop or the other using a shortcut in the Start menu. And then the last way, which is kind of my favorite, is using a keyboard shortcut. So there are keyboard shortcuts for most programs and most operating systems to do some of the common tasks, and it can really increase productivity if you learn to use those. So if you're on a Windows keyboard, Windows machine, then Control-Alt-T will open up the terminal. If you're on a Mac keyboard, that's Control-Option-T. So there's three different ways to bring up the terminal. Okay, so now we have a command line in Linux via the program called terminal. And here we can type some things and press enter and try to execute what we typed as a Linux command. Well, this garbage command that I just made up says command not found, which makes sense. But if we type an actual Linux command, then it will be executed. So let's learn our first Linux command. PWD. PWD tells you the present working directory. When talking about the present working directory, we also have a new vocab word that we should add. The acronym CWD, which stands for current working directory. Okay, so we've got PWD and CWD, which seem like the same thing, and they mostly are, but CWD is our vocab word for the current working directory, and PWD is the Linux command that will tell us the CWD. Now, I've been using the term directory, but I haven't defined it, so let's add that to our vocab list as well. Directory is just a fancy term for folder, so we can use them synonymously. Sometimes I'll use directory, sometimes I'll use folder, but they really mean the same thing. So let me give you a little bit of a background about the current working directory. I'm going to move my terminal over to the side to make room for opening up something called a file explorer. Now, down here in the bottom left, right next to our terminal in the taskbar, there's a little folder called the File Manager. So the File Manager is something you're really familiar with. If you're on Windows, you've been using something called the File Explorer. If you're on Mac, you've been using something called the Finder. And this really just gives you a graphical view of the files and folders or directories on your file system, on your hard drive, or if you're plugging in a flash drive on that flash drive, for example. So when we launch our File Manager or File Explorer, at the top up here, it has something called a path. And this path represents the current working directory. So right now it's /home/computer-science, but let's say I double click on Documents. Now it changes to /home/computer-science/documents. So right now, /home/computer-science/documents is the CWD, or the current working directory, of my file manager. So the terminal also has a current working directory. And if we type the command pwd and press enter, it will tell us the CWD. It says it's /home/computer-science. So now let's talk about paths. What is /home/computer-science? Well, that is something called a path. So we'll add it to our vocab list. Nice short definition we'll use for path: a location on a file system. Now back to our terminal. So our terminal told us the current working directory is /home/computer science. So that's a path that tells us a location on the file system. This is the location in which this terminal is operating. Now, if you are perhaps familiar with Mac, then this /home/computer science, this is your home directory for the current user, which is the computer science user. On our VM, there's only one user. There's no password to log in, and we can just use the computer science home directory on all of our different VMs. Now, if you're working on a Mac, perhaps like my last name is Sprint, so mine would say something like /home/Sprint, for example, if Sprint is the name of the user that I'm currently logged in as. Now, this is true also for Windows machines. You have a home directory that's dependent on which user is currently logged in, but it looks different. So let's talk a little bit about paths, absolute versus relative, and then how, if you're from a Windows background, you can kind of make sense of this. So there's two types of paths. One is absolute, the other is relative. So an absolute path denotes a unique location. And an absolute path starts with something called root, which on a Unix-based machine is a single forward slash. So let's add a terminology entry for root. So root is the topmost directory on a Unix file system. Now, if you're from a Windows background, I'll put in parens down here. This is like a drive in Windows. For example, your C drive is usually the drive that represents your hard drive, and the highest, most top level directory on that hard drive is just represented by the C drive, C:/. Note that this is a backslash, whereas in a Unix machine, they're forward slashes. So if we come back to our terminal and we look at the output of the pwd command, it says /home/computer science. This first slash right here represents the root directory, the top level directory on the file system. And then in the root directory, there is a directory called home. In the home directory, there is a directory called computer science, and that is where this terminal is currently operating in. This is an absolute path because it starts with root. Now let's take a look at relative paths. Relative path would be a location relative to the CWD. And I'll just put down here, relative paths do not start with root. So we haven't seen an example of a relative path yet, but we will here very, very, very shortly. It's a good way to keep track of absolute versus relative. Absolute starts with root. All right, so let's learn a few more Linux commands and then we'll call it good for this video. Now in our file archive, our file explorer over here, we can see essentially the contents of the /home/computer science/documents folder. If I back out, I can see the contents of the /home/computer science folder. In the terminal, I can't see the contents of the CWD, but with a Linux command, specifically the ls command, I can see the contents. So I'm going to type ls, and it's going to tell me the contents of the CWD. So ls, you can think of it as a listing of a directories contents. Now, if I want to get more details about each of the items in the current working directory, then I can go ahead and do an ls-l. The -l is called an option or a switch, and it essentially says, okay, ls command, I want something slightly different in the default behavior, and here's what I want. The -l denotes a long listing, so for each one of our files or folders in the CWD, it's going to tell us some more information like permissions and ownership, size, last modified date, etc. Now, if you ever want to know all of the different switches and options of a command, or even just how to use a command in general, there is a command that will help you use other commands. And that command is called man. So if I have man space the name of the command I want to get some help for, like ls, it will bring up some information about how to use the ls command. Now I can scroll through here. Here's all of the options available for using the ls command. Let me get down to the -l option. Right here, -l, use a long listing format. So that provides some information about how to use a command and how to use its various options. Lots in here. So let's add man to our Linux commands list. So I'm going to write view the manual for a command. And the reason why I wrote manual instead of like help or documentation is because that will help you remember the command. Man is short for manual pages. In fact, you can even man, and it will tell you how to use the man command. So here up here, the man command is for manual pager utils. Utils is usually short for utility or utility functions. So this just tells you how to use the manual pager utils. All right, the last command that I want to cover is cd, which is short for change directory. So in our file manager over here, you already saw me change directory. Like I double-clicked on documents to bring me to the documents directory, and then I pressed the back button in order to go back out of that documents directory. Well, we can do the same things in the terminal using commands. And the command we're going to use is cd. So cd is short for change directory. And with it, we can specify an absolute or relative path. So let's see our first example of using a relative path. Do an ls, excuse me, do an ls, see all of the folders that we can specify a relative path for because they're in the current working directory, and let's cd into documents. Note that the names of files and folders are case sensitive, so I do want a capital D on documents. Do a pwd to check to make sure that the directory did in fact change. That looks good. Do an ls to see the contents. Graphically, I can confirm that this does match. Awesome. Now, if I want, I could cd into, let's say, the bin folder and do an ls. There's a shell file here. Okay, cool. Now, graphically, I was able to go back to the parent directory or the directory that contains the current working directory by using the back button. To do this using cd, we have to learn something called a special directory. So let's first have terminology for parent. So a parent directory is the directory that contains the CWD. So for example, back in our code, or back in the terminal, the parent directory of this bin directory is documents. The parent directory of documents is computer science. The parent directory of home, the parent directory of computer science is home, and the parent directory of home is root. And root, by definition, has no parent directory. Now, to cd to the parent directory, we use cd ... And the ... is a special directory that refers to the parent. We could also specify an absolute path to cd out of a directory, but this is often more convenient just to back up one level. A few other things that I'll note here. cd dot. The dot refers to the CWD. So cd dot wouldn't do anything, but it's good to note the difference between a dot and a single dot, a dot and a double dot, because you may see these perhaps online when you're trying to learn more about Linux or in your travels. So good to know that dot refers to the current working directory. cd tilde. The tilde refers to the user's home directory. And then we could also do cd root to change directory to the root directory. But really all you need to know, cd change directory, specify an absolute or relative path. For relative paths, you can use special paths like ... for the parent, ... for the current working directory, tilde for the user's home directory. So let's try this out. Currently, I'm in /home/computerscience/documents/bin, and I want to cd out of bin into the documents folder. I'll do cd ... I'm out 1. I'll do cd ... again to get out of the documents directory, and now I'm back in the computer science directory. So this is just like pressing back on our file manager. Now let's try cd root. We're in the root directory. Just take a look at some of the files and folders in here. Now let's say I want to get back to /home/computerscience. I can do so with a cd tilde, which will bring me back to the currently logged in user's home directory. And there we are. So we learned a lot about Linux commands in the command line in this video. Be sure to practice with all of these commands until it becomes second nature. And if you're a little confused, maybe, okay, what does it mean to cd? Come back to that file manager or a file explorer or a finder, whatever analogy works for you, and just think about cd, like double clicking into a directory, cd ... back, like backing out of a directory. All of those sorts of things can help you when trying to translate these textual commands into maybe what is their graphical